about the space that spans between Brandeis and Borough. And I would like to hear from you, Ariel, how the EU competition law fit into this space.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So, in some ways, we have an easier task. We don't have to go more than a century back and second guess. What we have is a relatively recent set of legislation. Most recently, in 2007, the treaty was reconfirmed. So we can actually, when you ask me what is European competition law about, we can actually look at the law. And the law is important because if you think about competition law, competition we all understand is a subcategory of ideology. Competition law is a reflection of social value, is a reflection of political will. And European competition law provides us with a fairly clear idea of what it's about. And it's a rather long shopping list, actually. It is quite challenging, which explains why we often argue on which parts of that shopping list we favor or not, but that's the reality. So the law talks about competition law protecting consumer well-being, not even welfare, consumer well-being. Then in Mario Monti's period, one of the commissioners, he introduced consumer welfare to make sure that well-being will not be used by member states to inject too much political aspirations into competition. So he imported the value from the US with that purpose. So we can say competition law sets to protect consumer well-being and consumer welfare, but it doesn't stop there. European competition law is about protecting the competitive process. And from that, we also have the principle that it goes against distortions of the competitive process, which is why we have a special responsibility for dominant firms. It doesn't stop there. It is, of course, about an efficient market economy, but efficiency is being viewed through the prism of consumer welfare, which means that you have to actually show that the efficiencies benefits those relevant consumers. Then we have the value of fairness, which is, of course, very toxic in some ways and quite abstract. We have it specifically in the law. So we condemn unfair practices, unfair price, for instance. But it also is some sort of a normative background principle. It is not an intervention benchmark on its own, but it is something that does impact on the way we view the role of competition law. And in repeated statements from the commissioners, but also from the head of the commission, you hear about what it is. It is about creating a market economy where everyone have a share, a fair chance to compete, where customers get a fair share of the benefit, so something which is quite visible. It is also beyond all of that about the whole idea of the single market, so we have this whole usability of competition law as an instrument. So with that large shopping list, of course, you need to have a bit of a balanced diet. You need to have some trade-offs, because obviously you cannot always advance all these values, and consumer welfare quite naturally is at the forefront of the analysis, but different agencies and different individuals might have different ideas as to how to prioritize and how to organize those values, and may have slightly different ideas as to the trade-off. Even when you look at the European Union, the Commission, which is in some ways a reflection of a negotiation between the various entities in Europe, might present slightly varying views on the scope of competition. In the context of digital economy, the important thing about European competition law is that when you look at the law, at the very least what you have is a high degree of flexibility. You can certainly deal with upstream effects without even showing direct consumer harm. You can deal with so many elements that would give rise to concern, and that would fit neatly under the law. You don't have to go through acrobatics and some mental exercises to try and explain why it works. It is just part of the law. Which brings us, of course, to economics. So what is the role of economics? And here I think it is important to distinguish between the question of what is the goal of competition law, what are the values of European competition law, and the question of measurement. Of course, we all accept that economics provides an extremely valuable safeguard, some sort of a prism that helps us balance, create some sort of an ongoing systematic approach to the application. But economics, the discussion that you have on the adequate level of intervention, in my mind at least, has to be conducted within the understanding of what competition law is about. Because otherwise what you do is you replace the law, the purpose of the law, and the scope of the law with your own interpretation that you pretend to be some sort of value-free, a neutral interpretation. But in fact, what you do, you override the scope of the law. And this is when you could drive, and I would argue in the US to some extent that has happened with the Chicago School, you could drive antitrust into slight irrelevance by creating more and more barriers and by saying that what you care about is something very narrow, and therefore that redefines the law. So in my mind, the narrow view in the US, or the narrower view in the US, is a political choice. True, it is packed in an economic rationale, but don't let this fool you. I mean, the idea of advancing a certain narrative is a political choice. And in Europe, and that's important, the political choice was different. And this brings us to some sort of a friction that you sometimes find between the EU and the US. So the first thing that is slightly misleading is that we all speak the same language, and we all speak competition law or antitrust law, which makes people sometimes believe that it's the same idea, it's the same law. It's not. If you look at competition laws around the world, they differ so much from each other. In Japan, you have employment in that. In China, you have the stability of the Communist Party. All of those things you will say, oh God, how dare they do that? How dare they pollute our cherished competition law? The fact is, this was the will of the government, which means that it, hopefully, the will of the people. But the idea is that then when you have people assume that they can implant their version of what competition law is about from one jurisdiction to another, this to begin with, in my mind, is a result of their wrong assumption of the purity of their own system. Because there is this idea that if you focus on a very narrow application of antitrust on competition, narrow means purity. But narrow is also a judgment call. When you decide not to apply, you also make a certain decision. Now, of course, this is not a call for endless and unlimited intervention. What I'm trying to highlight is just that in Europe, we're lucky enough that we have a wider prism that was established. It creates a lot of complexity. And then we have a certain challenge of trying to position the economic analysis within that prism. And what many people argue in Europe is that the fact that you cannot count something doesn't mean that it doesn't count. So it's not only what you can measure through your prism that should be relevant. And this is why you sometimes have things, God forbid, such as fairness. Is this a fair behavior? And it's true, this is a very difficult standard. And indeed, when you look at the competition agencies, they try to deal with it in the most consistent manner they can. And in fact, what they do is they self-police themselves. So they limit it, and they try to rationalize almost everything through an economic prism, because this is what we can do. But when you face the digital economy, and suddenly you have non-price elements, it enables you, as the law needs to adapt, to move away from a price-centric analysis. And you can do that without having to stick into a very narrow prism, as in the US, obviously you have. And it puts us, I think, in a good position to use the existing laws and try to adapt them to a changing market reality. It also means that competition remains relevant. And the risk of not having competition relevant is real. Because if you look at the political debate in the US, because competition law failed to deliver, then what you have is a certain popular uprising. And then you have a swing completely to the other end, where people say, well, let's just break them. Let's just do whatever we believe is right. And in Europe, because competition is still relevant, and it actually is trying to do things, I think this is how we evaded some of that debate. Now, is it perfect? Far from it. No doubt about it. If anything, and how much time do I have? So thank you for that. No, but so last comment. If I remember what it was. No, so if anything, the risk that you have is the risk of introducing, because it is a bit vague, industrial policy into the analysis. But I want to say that economics is not immune from industrial policy, because we all understand the sponginess of the analysis and the possibility to advance various things. And true, you will pack it as something as pure as a diamond. But the reality is that you could advance certain arguments. In EU, we have now the German Franco proposal, which is a certain risk. The idea that you need to protect certain industries to create national champions, that is something that is certainly risky. But I have to say, even if you look at some of the comments that were made here yesterday, some of the speakers, using an economic rationale, say, Israel, pay attention, you need to make sure that you're not deterring investments. So even those of us that use this pure economic rationale, actually, without even noticing, embed in it something that goes beyond economics. We speak about make sure that you attract investments, make sure that you're not chilling the attractiveness of a certain territory. And I guess that just shows us that as much as all of us want to present ourselves as the advocates of a very consistent and stable discipline, the reality is that we're dealing with something that is more sponge-like than anything else. And our joint effort is to try and stabilize it. But it might just be that the way we stabilize it in one jurisdiction might look slightly different from another.